There was a boy in East St. Louis who owned a trumpet before he wanted one, and for a while it sat in its case like a dare he had not yet decided to take. His father had bought it for him on his 13th birthday, and his father was a man who believed in instruments the way other men believed in property or education, which is to say, completely and without sentiment. The trumpet was a gift, but also an expectation. The boy's name was Miles, and the house he lived in was large and well appointed, and through the windows in the late afternoon you could see the smoke rising from the foundries across the river in St. Louis proper, a city the family visited but did not belong to, not quite, not in the way they belonged to the smaller world on the Illinois side where black professionals had built their own careful version of prosperity. He did not love the trumpet at first. He took lessons because that was what was expected, and his teacher was a man who taught him to play without vibrato, a choice that seemed eccentric then, but would later become the signature of everything Miles Davis put into the world, the clean tone, the refusal of ornament. There is a photograph of him from those years, standing in a high school band uniform, the trumpet held at his side, his face unsmiling and already composed in that particular way that suggested he was listening to something the rest of the room could not hear. He was a good student, but not an extraordinary one, not yet. And the trumpet was still just an object, a thing he could do, rather than a thing he needed to do. The city he grew up in was split by the river and by everything the river represented. East St. Louis was a company town, a rail hub, a place where the Great Migration had deposited tens of thousands of black families from the South, all of them looking for work and safety and a future that did not require them to step off the sidewalk when white people passed. The Davis family had been there longer than most, and Miles's father owned land and racehorses and carried himself with the assurance of a man who had made something and meant to keep it. There was money, though not the kind that insulated you from the world. There were certain streets Miles was told not to walk down, certain parts of the city where his father's standing meant nothing at all. He learned early that dignity was a performance that required an audience willing to see it, and that in America such audiences were not guaranteed. The trumpet began to mean something different when he heard the records. His father's house was full of music, not jazz, but the kind of polished orchestral recordings that signified refinement. But Miles found jazz on the radio and in the clubs across the river, the places he was too young to enter, but not too young to wait outside and listen. He heard Louis Armstrong and Jimmy Lunsford and Duke Ellington, and he heard something in the trumpet that he had not understood it could do, which was to sound like a voice that had not yet learned to lie. Armstrong played with a vibrato so wide it seemed to embrace the whole world, but Miles heard past that to the architecture underneath, the way a solo could be built like a story, with a beginning that wandered and a middle that climbed and an end that left you somewhere you had not expected to be. By the time he was 16, he was good enough to play in local bands, and he was hired by Eddie Randall's Blue Devils, a group that played around St. Louis and needed a trumpet player who could read and show up on time. Miles could do both, and he could do something else, which was to play without drawing attention to himself, to lay down a solo that did not announce its own virtuosity, but instead fit into the shape of the song like it had always been there. The other musicians noticed. He was not flashy, not a showman, but he had time, which is what musicians call the thing that cannot be taught, the internal clock that lets you place a note exactly where it needs to be, not early, not late, but in the sliver of space where it becomes inevitable. He graduated from high school in 1944, and his father wanted him to go to Fisk University in Nashville, a good school, a respectable school, a place where young black men learned to be doctors or ministers. Miles said he wanted to study music, and his father, who was not a man easily swayed, eventually agreed to send him to New York to audition for Juilliard. The agreement was a compromise that neither of them quite believed. His father thought that a few months in New York would cure Miles of whatever romantic idea he had about music. Miles thought that if he could get to New York, he would never have to come back. He arrived in the city in September of 1944, 18 years old, carrying his trumpet and enough money for a few months' rent, and he enrolled at Juilliard because that was the condition of his father's support. But enrollment was not the same as attendance. He went to a few classes and found them bloodless, full of theory that seemed to have no relation to the music he had come to find. What he wanted was on 52nd Street, the strip of midtown clubs where bebop was being invented in real time by musicians who played so fast and with such disregard for the old rules that it sounded like a new language altogether. He went to the clubs every night: the Onyx, the famous Door, the Spotlight, the Three Deuces, and he stood as close to the bandstand as he could and watched Charlie Parker play. Parker was 24 and already a legend among the musicians who understood what he was doing, which was to take the language of jazz and break it down to its molecular level and rebuild it as something faster, denser, more harmonically complex than anything that had come before. He played the alto saxophone like he was trying to empty himself of every idea he had ever had all at once, long spiraling lines that twisted around the chord changes and dissolved the boundary between melody and improvisation. Miles had never heard anything like it. He went back the next night and the night after that, and eventually he worked up the nerve to introduce himself, and Parker, who had a way of recognizing hunger when he saw it, asked if he wanted to sit in. Miles played, and he was not good, not by the standards of the room. He had speed, but not Parker's speed, and he had ideas, but they came out tangled, and when he finished his solo he knew he had embarrassed himself. But Parker came up to him afterward and said, "You got a nice sound. Clean. Keep that." It was not a compliment exactly, but it was not dismissal either, and Miles held on to it like a rope. He quit Juilliard within a few months and started showing up at the clubs every night, not just to listen but to play. He sat in whenever he could, and he joined jam sessions that lasted until dawn, rooms full of musicians trying to outplay each other, testing ideas, stealing licks, working out the grammar of this new music. Bebop was a young man's game, fast and aggressive and technically ferocious, and Miles was young enough to keep up, but old enough to sense that the thing he had to offer was not going to be speed. He did not have Dizzy Gillespie's high-note acrobatics or Fats Navarro's fire. What he had was restraint, a willingness to let space into his playing, to leave a note hanging in the air long enough that you could hear its shape. He joined Parker's quintet in 1945, not because he was the best trumpet player available, but because Parker liked the way he played behind him, the way Miles's solos did not try to compete with Parker's, but instead offered something cooler, more subdued, a counterbalance. They recorded together, a session for Savoy Records in November of 1945, and if you listen to those recordings now, you can hear the difference between them. Parker plays like he is trying to outrun time itself, and Miles plays like he is trying to find the melody that Parker is leaving scattered in pieces behind him. The contrast worked. They played together for the next 3 years, and Miles learned everything Parker had to teach, which was not so much about notes as about freedom, the idea that the rules were only there so you could know which ones to break. But Parker was also a heroin addict, and by 1948 the addiction had progressed to the point where it was no longer clear whether the music was serving the addiction or the addiction was serving the music. He missed gigs, showed up too high to play, borrowed money he did not pay back, and Miles watched all of this with the attention of someone who understood that genius did not insulate you from anything. He started using heroin himself around this time, not because Parker encouraged it. Parker told him not to, told everyone not to, but because heroin was everywhere in the jazz world then, sold as a shortcut to creativity, a way to access the same reckless brilliance that Parker seemed to channel so effortlessly. It was not a shortcut, it was a trap, and Miles would spend the next decade trying to claw his way out of it. By 1949 he had decided that bebop was over, or at least that it had reached the end of what interested him. It was too fast, too dense, too relentless, and he wanted to make something that had room in it, music that breathed. He started meeting with a group of younger musicians in Gil Evans's apartment, a basement room on West 55th Street, that had a piano and not much else. Gill was an arranger, a white man from Canada who had spent years working with big bands and understood how to write for large ensembles in a way that felt orchestral without being stiff. The group that gathered in his apartment included Lee Konitz on alto saxophone, Jerry Mulligan on baritone saxophone, John Lewis on piano, and Max Roach on drums. They talked about texture, about dynamics, about how to make jazz that was complex without being aggressive, that could be quiet and still be serious. They rehearsed and argued and eventually recorded a series of sessions for Capitol Records, 12 tracks spread out over 3 sessions in 1949 and 1950. The music that came out of those sessions was later collected on an album called Birth of the Cool, and it was unlike anything else in jazz at the time. The arrangements were lush and carefully layered, with tuba and French horn alongside the traditional rhythm section, and the solos were short and melodic, built around the arrangement rather than in spite of it. Miles played with a softness that some critics mistook for lack of technique. But it was not lack, it was choice. He used a mute to smooth out his tone, and he played in the middle register, avoiding the high notes that were supposed to signal excitement, and the result was music that felt like it was being played at 3 in the morning in a room where everyone had finally stopped trying to impress each other. Birth of the Cool was not a commercial success when it was released, and it was not initially understood as a turning point, but it planted a seed. It suggested that jazz did not have to be fast to be modern, that space and silence could be as expressive as speed, and that Miles Davis was not going to be the kind of musician who followed the trends. He was going to set them. The early 1950s were hard years. Miles was using heroin regularly, and the drug had a way of narrowing the world until the only thing that mattered was the next fix. He lost gigs, lost money, lost the respect of musicians who had believed in him. His father stopped sending money. He stole from friends, pawned his trumpet more than once, showed up at recording sessions too sick to play. There are recordings from this period where you can hear the struggle in his tone, the way the notes come out pinched and uncertain, and there are other sessions where he simply did not show up at all. He moved back to East Louis for a while, trying to get clean, but he relapsed and went back to New York, and the cycle continued. He finally quit heroin in 1954, not because of any intervention or program, but because he decided he was done. He locked himself in his father's house in East St. Louis and went through withdrawal alone, sweating and shaking and vomiting for 2 weeks, and when he came out the other side, he was not cured, not in any permanent sense, but he was clean enough to play again. He went back to New York and started rebuilding his career, and one of the first things he did was form a new quintet. The musicians he gathered around him in 1955 were not the biggest names in jazz, but they were the ones who understood what he was trying to do. John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, Red Garland on piano saxophone, Red Garland on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, Philly Joe Jones on drums. Coltrane was still developing, still searching for his voice, and his solos could be long and a little shapeless. But Miles heard something in him, a hunger and a willingness to take risks, and he gave him space to work it out. The rhythm section was loose and propulsive, and together they played a style that came to be called hard bop, which was bebop slowed down just enough that you could hear the blues underneath. They recorded a series of albums for Prestige Records, sessions that were done quickly and released under titles like Cookin', Relaxin', Workin', and Stamin'. And the music on those records is some of the most relaxed and confident jazz of the decade. Miles's playing was sharper than it had been in years, his tone clear and full, and his solos had a logic to them, a sense of narrative that made even his most abstract ideas feel like they were telling a story. He was not trying to play faster than anyone else. He was trying to play better, which is a different thing. In 1955, he signed with Columbia Records, a major label with money and distribution and the ability to turn a jazz musician into something like a star. His first album for Columbia was Round About Midnight, released in 1957, and it was his first record to reach a broad audience. The title track was a slow, mournful ballad, and Miles played it with a restraint that made every note feel weighted, like each one had been chosen from a dozen possibilities, and this was the only one that made sense. The album sold well, and suddenly Miles Davis was not just a musician's musician, but a name that people outside the jazz world recognized. He was also becoming known for the way he looked. He had always been vain, always cared about clothes, but in the late 1950s, he started dressing with a deliberateness that made it clear he understood fashion as a form of communication. He wore tailored Italian suits, narrow ties, shirts in colors that other men would not have risked. He moved through the world like he owned it, and the effect was magnetic. He was handsome, light-skinned, and he carried himself with a coolness that seemed effortless, but was actually the result of enormous discipline. He did not smile in photographs. He did not make small talk. He played with his back to the audience, and when he finished a solo, he walked off the stage and let the rest of the band play without him. It was arrogance, but it was also a refusal to perform the kind of gratitude that white audiences expected from black musicians. He did not bow. He did not grin. He played, and then he left. And if you did not like it, you could leave too. The quintet he had formed in 1955 was evolving. Coltrane was becoming a more forceful presence, his solos longer and more searching, and the interplay between him and Miles was becoming the centerpiece of the band's sound. Miles played short, melodic phrases, clear and direct, and Coltrane answered with cascades of notes, dense and exploratory, and the contrast between them created a tension that kept the music from settling into anything predictable. But Coltrane was also struggling with his own heroin addiction, and by 1957 it had reached the point where Miles fired him. It was not done gently. Miles told him to get clean or stay gone, and Coltrane went back to Philadelphia and kicked the drug, and when he came back a year later he was a different player, more focused, more certain, and the quintet became even stronger. By 1958 Miles was thinking about something new. Hard bop was fine, but it had started to feel like a refinement of bebop rather than a departure from it, and he wanted to break away from the chord changes that structured almost all jazz improvisation, the way a solo had to follow a predetermined harmonic path, moving from chord to chord like stepping stones across a river. He started experimenting with modal jazz, which was built around scales rather than chords, and which gave the soloist much more freedom to explore a single harmonic area without having to keep moving. It was not a completely new idea. George Russell had written about it, and classical composers had used modes for centuries, but no one had tried to build an entire jazz album around it. He gathered the musicians in the Columbia Records studio in New York on 2 days in the spring of 1959, March 2nd and April 22nd, and the group he brought in was the best he had ever assembled. Coltrane on tenor saxophone, Cannonball Adderley on alto saxophone, Bill Evans on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, Jimmy Cobb on drums, and for one track, Wynton Kelly on piano. Miles had written out sketches for the tunes, just rough outlines, and he explained them to the musicians on the day of the recording. There was almost no rehearsal. He wanted the music to be fresh, to have the feeling of discovery, and he believed that if the musicians were good enough, they would find their way. The album that came out of those sessions was called Kind of Blue, and it is the best-selling jazz album in history, and it is also one of those rare records that sounds exactly like what people imagine jazz should sound like before they have ever really listened to jazz. It is not aggressive or difficult or inaccessible. It is calm and spacious and beautiful, and it moves with the inevitability of water finding its level. The first track, So What, is built around a 2-note bass line, a simple question-and-answer figure, and the soloists improvise over a D minor scale for 16 bars and then shift up a half step to E-flat minor for 8 bars and then back to D minor. That is the entire harmonic structure, and it is so simple that it feels like it was always there, like Miles had not invented it, but uncovered it. His solo on So What is a lesson in economy. He plays short phrases, often leaving long stretches of silence between them, and every note feels necessary. He does not fill the space. He lets the space be part of the music, and the effect is that you can hear the architecture of his ideas, the way each phrase leads to the next, not through speed or density, but through logic. He plays like he is thinking out loud, turning an idea over in his hands, considering it from different angles, and then moving on before it becomes too familiar. Bill Evans plays with a lightness that makes the piano sound like it is floating, and his harmonic choices are subtle and surprising, full of the kind of dissonances that resolve so gently you almost do not notice them. Coltrane plays with more intensity, his solos longer and more probing, and there is a moment in Freddie Freeloader where he seems to be pushing against the structure of the tune, trying to find a way out of it, but the rhythm section holds steady and he eventually comes back to the melody. Cannonball Adderley plays with a bluesy warmth that balances the cooler tones of the rest of the group, and his solos have a conversational quality, like he is telling you a story and wants to make sure you are following along. The album was recorded quickly, most tracks done in 1 or 2 takes, and the lack of polish is part of what makes it work. You can hear the musicians listening to each other, responding in real time, and the music has the quality of something that is happening rather than something that has been rehearsed. It feels alive. The second session, in April, added Flamenco Sketches, a track built around 5 scales, each one lasting as long as the soloist wanted, and the result is the most open-ended piece on the album, a meditation that drifts without ever feeling aimless. Kind of Blue was released in August of 1959, and it sold steadily, not in a sudden rush but over years and then decades, until it became the record that people bought when they wanted to understand what jazz was. It is the album that plays in coffee shops and bookstores, the album that people put on at night when they want something that does not demand attention but rewards it if you give it. It is not aggressive or confrontational. It is simply beautiful, and its beauty is the kind that does not fade because it is not built on novelty or surprise, but on proportion and balance, the same things that make a piece of architecture or a line of poetry feel inevitable. Miles did not linger on the achievement. He was already thinking about what came next, and what came next was a different band. Coltrane left in 1960 to form his own group, and Cannonball left to do the same, and Miles began assembling a new quintet that would take him through the first half of the 1960s. The new group included Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, and Tony Williams on drums, and they were all younger than Miles, still in their 20s, and they played with a looseness and a willingness to take risks that pushed Miles into new territory. Wayne Shorter wrote compositions that were elliptical and mysterious, tunes that did not resolve in the expected ways, and his solos were full of sudden shifts in direction, ideas that seemed to start in the middle and end before they were finished. Herbie Hancock was a pianist who could play with the harmonic sophistication of Bill Evans, but also with a percussive edge, and he was not afraid to abandon the chords altogether, if the moment called for it. Ron Carter played bass with a melodic sensibility, his lines as much a part of the conversation as the solos. And Tony Williams, who was only 17 when he joined the band, played drums like he was trying to dismantle the kit and rebuild it while the song was still going, shifting rhythms mid-phrase, pushing and pulling the tempo, creating a sense of instability that was thrilling and occasionally terrifying. This quintet, which came to be called the Second Great Quintet, played a kind of jazz that was harder to categorize than anything Miles had done before. It was not hard bop, not modal, not free jazz, but something in between, a music that had structure, but also allowed for the structure to be questioned in real time. They recorded a series of albums in the mid-1960s, ESP, Miles Smiles, Sorcerer, Nefertiti, and the music on those records is restless and exploratory, full of moments where the band seems to be on the verge of falling apart, but never quite does. Miles's solos became sparer, more fragmented, and there are passages where he plays just a handful of notes and lets the rhythm section create the world around them. He was also dealing with pain. He had been in a car accident in the late 1950s, and the injuries had left him with chronic hip problems, and by the mid-1960s he was in pain much of the time. He played through it, but it changed the way he moved, the way he stood on stage. And there are photographs from this period where you can see the tension in his posture, the way he holds himself like something might break if he shifts his weight the wrong way. He married Frances Taylor in 1958, a dancer who was beautiful and talented and who understood the demands of a creative life because she had her own. But the marriage was not easy. Miles was controlling and jealous, and he was sometimes violent, and Frances left him more than once before the marriage finally ended in the late 1960s. He would later marry other women, Betty Mabry, Cicely Tyson, and those marriages also ended, and the pattern was consistent enough that it is impossible not to see it as part of who he was, the same person who could play with such tenderness and restraint on the bandstand and be so hard in his personal life. It was not a contradiction that was solved. It was the central tension of his life, the space between the control he exercised in his music and the control he tried to exercise over the people around him, and it caused harm to the people he loved and to himself. In the late 1960s, he started to become interested in electric instruments. Rock music was everywhere, and Miles listened to it, to Jimi Hendrix and Sly Stone and James Brown, and he heard something in the electric guitar and the electric bass that he wanted to bring into his own music. It was not that he wanted to play rock, he was too much of a jazz musician for that, but he wanted the energy, the directness, the way rock could hit you in the body without asking permission. He started bringing electric pianos into the studio and then electric guitars, and the music that came out of those sessions was denser and more layered than anything he had done before, full of overlapping rhythms and textures that shifted from moment to moment. The album that resulted from this period was Brew, recorded in August of 1969 and released in the spring of 1970. It was a double album, which was unusual for jazz, and the music on it was long and sprawling with tracks that stretched past 20 minutes, and it was built around grooves rather than melodies, rhythms that repeated and mutated and created a sense of motion that was almost hypnotic. Miles played trumpet, but also used effects, running his horn through a wah-wah pedal, and the result was a sound that was both familiar and alien, recognizably his, but filtered through something new. The band he assembled for Brew was large and eclectic, with multiple keyboard players, multiple percussionists, a guitarist, a bass clarinetist, and a rhythm section that included both electric and acoustic instruments. The musicians included Wayne Shorter, Benny Maupin, Joe Zawinul, Chick Corea, John McLaughlin, and Dave Holland, among others, and Miles directed them in the studio the way a film director might work with actors, giving them rough ideas and then letting them improvise, editing the results afterward to create something that felt composed, even though much of it was spontaneous. Brew was not universally loved. Jazz purists hated it, said it was a sellout, said Miles had abandoned jazz for rock, said the music was formless and self-indulgent, but it sold better than any album Miles had made since Kind of Blue, and it reached an audience that had never listened to jazz before, younger listeners who were used to long album side tracks and electric instruments and music that did not resolve into neat conclusions. It was fusion, jazz-rock fusion, and Miles was its most visible and controversial pioneer. He toured with an electric band through the early 1970s, and the concerts were loud and chaotic, full of energy, but also full of a kind of aggression that was new to his music. He played shorter sets, sometimes just an hour, and he still turned his back to the audience, but now it felt less like arrogance and more like necessity. Like he was so deep inside the music that acknowledging the audience would break the spell. He wore bright clothes, wild colors, dashikis, and leather pants, and he looked like a rock star, which is what he was becoming, at least in terms of visibility. But the pain was getting worse. His hip deteriorated to the point where walking was difficult, and he had surgery, and the recovery was long and incomplete. He developed ulcers, bleeding ulcers, and he was hospitalized more than once. He was using cocaine, not heavily at first, but more as the decade went on, and the drug sharpened his temper and made him more erratic, more difficult to work with. Musicians came and went, and the bands he led in the early 70s were less stable than the groups he had put together in the past. He recorded prolifically on the corner, Get Up With It, Agartha, Pangea, and the music on those albums was dense and difficult, full of loops and electronic textures, and it divided his audience even further. Some heard it as visionary, a glimpse of where music could go. Others heard it as the sound of a great artist losing his way. By 1975, he was exhausted. The pain, the drugs, the decades of touring and recording and reinventing himself, all of it had taken a toll, and he decided to stop. He did not announce a retirement. He simply stopped playing. He withdrew to his brownstone on West 77th Street in Manhattan and disappeared from public life. For 6 years he did not perform, did not record, barely left the house. He watched television, painted, used cocaine, saw almost no one. The silence was profound and strange, and in the jazz world it became a kind of legend in itself. The mystery of what Miles was doing, whether he would ever come back. He came back in 1981, not because he had resolved the things that had driven him into isolation, but because he was bored and because he needed money. His first concerts were tentative, and his playing was not what it had been, the tone thinner, the ideas less focused. But he was Miles Davis, and people wanted to see him, and he toured steadily through the 1980s, playing a version of electric jazz that incorporated elements of pop and funk and R&B. He recorded albums with Marcus Miller, a bassist and producer who understood how to build tracks that were radio-friendly without being simplistic, and the music on those albums, Tutu, Amandlo, was sleek and polished, full of synthesizers and programmed drums, and it bore almost no resemblance to the music Miles had made in the 50s and 60s. The jazz community did not know what to make of it. Some saw it as a continuation of his refusal to be nostalgic, his insistence on staying contemporary. Others saw it as a diminishment, a great artist coasting on his reputation. Miles did not seem to care. He wore bright clothes, played shorter solos, collaborated with pop musicians, appeared on television. He was in pain most of the time. His hips were shot, his health was failing, but he kept performing, kept recording, kept moving forward, because that was the only direction he knew. He was also going blind. Diabetes and years of poor health had damaged his eyes, and by the late 80s he could barely see, though he did not talk about it much. He played from memory, relying on his ear and his decades of experience, and if you watch footage from his final concerts, you can see the way he moves carefully, tentatively, like someone navigating a space that is no longer fully visible. He died on September 28, 1991, in Santa Monica, California, from pneumonia and respiratory failure and the accumulated damage of a life lived hard. He was 65. The funeral was held in New York, and the musicians who came to pay their respects included most of the major figures in jazz, people who had played with him, or learned from him, or simply understood that he was the central figure of the music, the one everyone was measured against. The obituaries called him a genius, which was true, and a pioneer, which was also true, and they noted his difficult personality, his struggles with addiction, his violence toward women, the things that were harder to reconcile with the image of the artist as hero. The music press tried to assess his legacy, to rank the periods, to decide which version of Miles Davis mattered most, and the consensus, if there was one, was that he had reinvented jazz so many times that it was impossible to separate the music from the man who made it. Kind of Blue remained his most famous work, the album that introduced more people to jazz than any other, and it continued to sell year after year, its calm beauty as appealing to new listeners as it had been to the people who first heard it in 1959. But his influence was not limited to that one record. The birth of the Cool Sessions had created a lineage of musicians who valued restraint and arrangement. The hard bop quintet with Coltrane had set a standard for small group interplay that every jazz combo since has tried to live up to. The modal experiments opened up harmonic possibilities that musicians are still exploring. The electric period, controversial as it was, had given birth to fusion, a genre that produced Weather Report, Return to Forever, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and dozens of other groups that mixed jazz with rock and funk and electronics. Miles had also been a talent scout, a band leader who had an uncanny ability to recognize musicians before they became famous and to put them in contexts where they could develop. John Coltrane, Bill Evans, Cannonball Adderley, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, Chick Corea, Keith Jarrett, John McLaughlin, all of them had played in Miles's bands, and all of them had gone on to lead their own groups and make their own contributions to the music. He was not a teacher in any formal sense, but he taught by example, by setting a standard, by showing that it was possible to keep moving forward, to refuse nostalgia, to treat the past as a place you came from rather than a place you return to. The central tension of his life, the gap between his genius and his cruelty, did not resolve after his death. The women he had hurt did not forgive him simply because he was gone, and the legacy of that harm is part of the story, not a footnote. Frances Taylor, in her memoir, described a marriage that was marked by jealousy and control and violence, and she made it clear that the Miles Davis who played with such tenderness on Kind of Blue was also the Miles Davis who hit her, who isolated her, who made her life smaller. The contradiction is not something that can be explained away, not by genius, not by the pressures of being a black man in a racist country, not by addiction. It is simply there, a fact that complicates the story, but does not erase the music. The music remains. Kind of Blue still sounds like the most beautiful accident in jazz, a collection of first takes and sketches that somehow coalesced into something perfect. So What still feels like a conversation that never needs to end, and Blue in Green still sounds like the saddest song ever played by people who are not trying to make you sad. Bitches Brew still sounds like the future, even though the future it imagined never quite arrived. The hard bop recordings with Coltrane still crackle with the energy of two musicians pushing each other to go further. The Birth of the Cool sessions still sound like a secret being shared in a quiet room. Miles Davis was the most innovative musician in the history of jazz, and that claim, which might sound like hyperbole, is actually just a description of what he did. He did not invent jazz, but he reinvented it over and over. At moments when the music seemed to have settled into a stable form, he turned bebop into cool jazz, and then he turned cool jazz into hard bop, and then he turned hard bop into modal jazz, and then he turned modal jazz, and then he turned modal jazz into fusion. Each time he left behind musicians who wanted him to stay where he was, to keep playing the music that had made him famous. And each time he refused. His refuse was not just aesthetic. It was personal, a rejection of the idea that an artist's job was to repeat himself, to become a curator of his own past. He hated nostalgia. He would not play So What in concert in the 1980s, would not give audiences the satisfaction of hearing the notes they had come to hear. He played new music, difficult music, music that sometimes did not work, and he did it because the alternative, which was to become a living museum, was unbearable to him. There is a video of him from the late 80s, an interview where he is asked about Kind of Blue, and he waves the question away, says he does not listen to his old records, says he is not interested in what he did 30 years ago. The interviewer persists, asks what it was like to make that record, and Miles looks at him with something close to pity and says, "Man, I don't remember. That was a long time ago." It is not modesty. It is a statement of principle. The past is not a place you live. The silence of the 1970s, the 6 years when he did not play, is often treated as a mystery, but it was not mysterious to the people who knew him. He was tired. He was in pain. He had spent 30 years at the center of jazz, and the music had moved on without waiting for him, and he needed to step away to figure out if he still had anything to say. The answer, when he came back, was complicated. He was not the same musician, not as sharp, not as inventive. but he was still Miles Davis, and he still had presence, still had the ability to make a single note feel like an event. The late albums, the ones made with Marcus Miller, are not great albums, not by the standard of Kind of Blue or Bitches Brew, but they are not embarrassments either. They are the work of an older artist trying to stay relevant, trying to find a way to make music in a world that had changed around him, and if the results are uneven, they are also evidence of a refusal to give up. He could have spent his final years playing the old tunes, touring as a nostalgia act, letting audiences applaud the memory of what he had been. He chose not to. He chose to keep moving, even if the movement was less graceful than it had been. He chose not to. He chose to keep moving, even in the fifth Bethnet. Wayne Shorter, who played with Miles in the 60s and remained close to him for the rest of his life, said after Miles died that what he admired most was the willingness to fail. He was not afraid to play something that did not work, Shorter said. He knew that if you are not failing sometimes, you are not trying hard enough. It is a musician's way of describing bravery, and it fits. Miles was brave, not in the sense of physical courage, though he had that too, but in the sense of artistic risk. He was willing to make records that alienated his audience, to break up bands that were working, to walk away from success and start over. The legacy he left is not a single style or a single album, but a way of thinking about what it means to be an artist. He showed that it was possible to honor tradition without being imprisoned by it, to be technically skilled without being showy, to be innovative without being incomprehensible. He showed that jazz could be cool, that it could be sophisticated, that it did not have to be loud or fast to be serious. He showed that Black American music could be modern, forward-looking, global, and that it did not need to explain itself or justify itself to anyone. He also showed, though not intentionally, that genius does not excuse harm, that the ability to make beautiful things does not give you permission to hurt the people around you. The truth of Miles Davis includes both the music and the violence, and any account that leaves out one or the other is incomplete. In the years since his death, Kind of Blue has continued to sell, continued to be the album that people buy when they want to understand jazz, and it is possible now to hear it not just as a great album, but as a kind of ideal, a version of what jazz could be, at its best collaborative, spacious, beautiful, and seemingly effortless. The fact that it was not effortless, that it was the result of years of practice and thought and refinement, is part of what makes it remarkable. It sounds like it was always there, waiting to be discovered. The electric period has been rehabilitated over time. Fusion, which was dismissed by many critics in the 70s as a commercial sellout, is now understood as a legitimate branch of jazz, and Bitches Brew is taught in music schools as an example of how to build long-form improvisations around grooves rather than chord changes. The musicians who played on that album, Chick Corea, John McLaughlin, Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter, all went on to lead their own fusion bands, and the music they made in the 70s and 80s owes a direct debt to the experiments Miles initiated. The modal work has been absorbed into the vocabulary of jazz, to the point where it is hard to remember that it was once controversial. Younger musicians learn to improvise over modes the same way they learn to improvise over chord changes, and the idea that you could build a whole tune around a single scale no longer seems radical. It is just one of the tools in the kit. The cool jazz of the late 40s and early 50s has become a historical footnote, overshadowed by Kind of Blue, but it was the first sign that Miles was not going to follow the trends, that he was going to set them, and it pointed the way toward everything that came after. The hard bop recordings with Coltrane remain the gold standard for small group jazz, the benchmark that every quintet or quartet is measured against. The interplay between Miles and Coltrane, the way they balanced each other, the way Miles's economy highlighted Coltrane's abundance, is still studied and emulated, and the recordings they made together, Milestones, Something Else, the Prestige sessions, are still in print, still selling, still being discovered by new listeners. Miles Davis never won a Grammy for Kind of Blue, at least not when it was released. The award for Best Jazz Performance in 1959 went to someone else, and Miles did not win a Grammy at all until 1970, for Brew, and by that point the award meant less to him than it might have earlier. He won more in the years after: Lifetime Achievement Awards, Hall of Fame inductions, all the honors that get given to artists once they are old enough that the establishment no longer feels threatened by them. He accepted them, or his representatives did, but he never seemed to care much. He cared about the music, about whether it was any good, and he was his own harshest critic. In his autobiography, published in 1989, he wrote about his career with a bluntness that was startling. He did not romanticize the past, did not pretend that everything he had done was great. He talked about the heroin years with regret, but also with a kind of matter-of-factness, like it was just something that had happened, a detour that cost him time but did not define him. He talked about the violence with less clarity, describing it in ways that suggested he did not fully understand why he had done what he had done, and the lack of understanding reads as evasion, a refusal to look at the thing directly. The book was a bestseller, and it gave readers a version of Miles Davis that was more complicated than the myth, more human and more flawed, and it did not entirely match the image of the cool, untouchable figure that the public had imagined. He was cool, but the coolness was a performance, a way of protecting himself in a world that was hostile to black men who refused to perform deference. Under the coolness was anger, pain, ambition, insecurity, all the things that drive people to make art and also to hurt each other. Herbie Hancock, who played piano in the Second Great Quintet, said in an interview many years after Miles died that what he learned from Miles was not about music, or not only about music, but about fearlessness. He taught me that it was okay to take risks, to try things that might not work, to trust your instincts even when they led you somewhere uncomfortable. It is a tribute that captures something essential, the way Miles functioned not just as a bandleader, but as a kind of permission, a model for how to live as an artist. Coltrane, who died in 1967, long before Miles, said something similar in one of his last interviews. He said that playing with Miles had taught him to edit, to leave space, to trust that silence could be as powerful as sound. Miles plays what he hears, and he hears what most people miss. Coltrane said. He hears the space between the notes. It is a musician's observation, but it is also a way of describing a philosophy, the idea that what you leave out is as important as what you put in. The trumpeters who came after Miles Wynton Marsalis, Terence Blanchard, Ambrose Akinna-Messiah, Christian Scott had to contend with his shadow, and they all found different ways to do it. Marsalis went in the opposite direction, embracing tradition, playing acoustic bebop, arguing that fusion and electric jazz were distractions from the real work of jazz. Others followed Miles's example, kept pushing forward, kept experimenting with electronics and rock and hip-hop. The division that Miles created in the jazz world, between the traditionalists and the progressives, is still there, and it is still contentious, and he is still the figure that both sides claim and both sides argue about. His clothes, his style, the way he moved through the world, became as influential as his music. Designers referenced him. Photographers sought him out. He was on the cover of magazines, not just music magazines, but fashion magazines, and he understood that his image was part of his art, that the way he presented himself was a statement about who he was and what he valued. He was not trying to blend in. He was trying to stand out, to be visible, to claim space in a world that wanted him to be smaller. The racism he faced was constant and casual, and sometimes violent. He was beaten by police in 1959 outside Birdland in New York for standing in front of the club where his name was on the marquee. The police told him to move along, and he said he worked there, and they did not believe him, or did not care, and they beat him and arrested him, and the photograph of him afterward, his face swollen, appeared in the papers as evidence of nothing. Just another story about a black man who did not comply. He talked about it in interviews, the way the police treated him, the way white people treated him, the assumption that no matter how famous he was or how much money he made, he was still just a black man who could be put in his place. It never stopped. It was part of his life until the end. He played benefits, raised money for civil rights causes, supported black musicians, but he was not an activist in the way that some of his contemporaries were. He did not make speeches. He did not march. His politics were in his music, in his refusal to perform deference, in the way he insisted on being treated as an equal, as an artist, not as an entertainer whose job was to make white people comfortable. The coolness, the refusal to smile, the turned back, all of it was political, a quiet insistence on dignity. There is a moment in a concert film from the 1960s, Jazz on a Summer's Day, where Miles is playing at the Newport Jazz Festival, and the camera catches him between songs, standing alone on stage, not acknowledging the applause, just waiting for the next tune to start. He looks bored, or maybe just patient, and there is something in his posture, in the way he holds himself, that communicates a kind of defiance. He is there, but he is not there for you. He is there for the music. That stance, that refusal, became part of what people meant when they called him cool. Cool was not just an aesthetic, it was a survival strategy, a way of moving through a world that wanted to diminish you without letting it touch you. Miles perfected it, turned it into an art form, and in doing so, he gave other people, not just musicians but anyone who felt like they did not fit, a model for how to be. Kind of Blue turned 65 in 2024, the same age Miles was when he died, and it is still selling, still being discovered, still being played in cafes and bedrooms and late-night drives, still serving as an introduction to jazz for people who did not grow up with it. It has become part of the cultural landscape, as familiar as a standard, and its familiarity does not diminish it. If anything, the familiarity is the point. It is an album that sounds like it has always existed, like it was not made but found, and every generation finds it again and hears something new. The music Miles made in the 1970s, the electric music that was so controversial when it was released, has aged in interesting ways. Some of it sounds dated now, tied to the technology and the production techniques of the era, but some of it sounds prophetic, like he was hearing something that would not fully arrive until decades later. The loops, the layering, the way he used the studio as an instrument, all of it anticipated the way music would be made in the digital age, and younger producers and DJs have sampled his work, built tracks around his trumpet lines, treated him as a forerunner. The silence, the 6 years when he did not play, remains the most mysterious part of his story, not because it is hard to understand why someone would need to step away, but because it is hard to imagine Miles Davis, who spent his whole life moving forward, sitting still. The people who saw him during those years said he was depressed, said he was using drugs, said he watched television all day, and painted and did not talk much. The paintings he made during that time were abstract, colorful, not particularly accomplished but earnest, the work of someone trying to fill the hours. He never showed them publicly, never tried to sell them as art. They were just something he did when he could not do the thing he was supposed to do. When he came back in 1981, the first concerts were tentative. His chops were not what they had been, his tone thinner, his breath control shakier, and he knew it. He worked to rebuild his embouchure, practiced, and slowly the sound came back. Not all the way, but enough. He played smaller venues at first, clubs rather than concert halls, and the audiences were forgiving, grateful just to see him again. The reviews were mixed. Some critics said he was back, others said he had nothing left to say. He kept going. He recorded with younger musicians, people like Marcus Miller and John Scofield, and the music they made was sleek and modern and built around synthesizers and drum machines, and it sounded nothing like Kind of Blue or Bitches Brew, and that was the point. He was not interested in sounding like his old self. He was interested in sounding like his old self. He was interested in sounding like his old self. He was interested in sounding contemporary, and if that meant working with technology that other jazz musicians disdained, so be it. He covered pop songs, Cyndi Lauper, Michael Jackson, and he played them straight, without irony, because he liked them, because they had melodies, because melody was what mattered to him. There is a recording of him playing Human Nature, the Michael Jackson song, and it is one of the best things he did in the 1980s. A slow, tender version where his trumpet sounds almost fragile, and the melody is played with such care that it becomes something new. It is not jazz in any traditional sense, but it is Miles Davis, and it has the same quality that his best work always had, the sense that every note has been chosen, that nothing is there by accident. He died before he could finish the work he was starting, and there are tapes and sketches and unfinished recordings that have been released posthumously, some of them interesting, some of them slight. The music he made in his final years is not the music he will be remembered for, but it is part of the story, the last chapter of a life that never stopped moving. His funeral was attended by musicians and actors and writers and people who had never met him but felt like they knew him, because they had lived with his music for so long. Quincy Jones spoke, and he talked about Miles's refusal to be anything other than himself, his refusal to compromise, his refusal to play the game. Shirley Horn sang, Max Roach played. The music was quiet and respectful and nothing like the music Miles would have played, but it was what the moment required. He is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx in a grave that is marked with a simple headstone, and people still visit, still leave flowers, still stand there for a while, and if the cemetery is quiet enough, you can almost imagine what they are hearing. The question of what kind of blue means, why it has lasted, why it continues to reach people who know nothing about jazz, is not a question that has a single answer. Part of it is the beauty, the way the music moves, the way it feels both sad and hopeful, the way it sounds like a conversation between people who trust each other. Part of it is the simplicity, the way the harmonic structure is so open that it does not require any special knowledge to follow. Part of it is the mood, the way it sounds like late night, like the hours when the day has ended, but sleep has not yet arrived, the in-between time when thoughts drift and settle. But part of it is also Miles himself, the way his presence is felt in every note, the way his restraint becomes a kind of generosity, the way he leaves space for the listener to enter the music and find their own way through. He does not tell you what to feel. He plays, and you feel what you feel, and that openness, that refusal to dictate is what makes the album feel like it belongs to everyone who hears it. Jazz, as a form, has always been about conversation, about musicians listening to each other and responding in real time, and Kind of Blue is the best example of that conversation, the moment when everyone in the room is listening so carefully that the music seems to play itself. Miles leads, but he does not dominate. He sketches an idea, and the others fill it in, and the result is something that no single person could have made alone. That collaborative quality, that sense of shared creation, is part of what makes his legacy so complicated. He was the leader, the one whose name was on the albums, the one who got the credit and the fame, but he could not have done what he did without the musicians he gathered around him, and some of them, Coltrane especially, became just as famous, just as influential, and their contributions are inseparable from his. The question of who deserves credit, who made what, is less interesting than the fact that it happened at all, that a group of musicians in a studio in New York in 1959 made something that would still be listened to 65 years later. Miles Davis did not invent jazz, but he redefined it so many times that it is hard to imagine what the music would have been without him. He was not the best trumpet player, not in terms of technical skill, but he was the most important, the one who mattered most, and the reason he mattered was not just the music he made, but the way he made it, the fearlessness, the refusal to stay in one place, the insistence on moving forward even when it meant leaving people behind. He was cruel, he was brilliant. He was a genius, and a monster, and a pioneer, and a cautionary tale, and the music he made contains all of that, the beauty and the harm, the tenderness and the violence, and it does not resolve into a simple story. It is the story of a man who made something extraordinary and paid for it in ways that he understood and in ways that he did not. And the music remains, outlasting the man, outlasting the myths, still playing in rooms where no one remembers his name, still finding its way to people who need it, who put it on when the world is too loud and they need something that understands what it means to be quiet. The trumpet is a difficult instrument, unforgiving in the way it exposes weakness, and Miles played it like he was searching for something, like each note was a question, and the next note was an attempt at an answer, and the search never ended, not in Kind of Blue, not in Bitches Brew, not in the final concerts when his breath was failing and his body was breaking down. He kept searching, and the search was the work, and the work was the life, and the life, with all its beauty and all its damage, is what remains.